All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack a fascinating and honestly very physical dilemma that happens during congregational prayers. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a super specific yet incredibly relatable issue that happens all the time in the mosque. We'll be drawing entirely from a published Q&A by the late Sheikh Abu Iyas. He really digs into the jurisprudence, the psychology, and, most importantly, the linguistics behind a very common practice during prayer. We're going to break down his analysis step by step to see exactly where this comes from and whether it actually lines up with the core tenets of Islamic law. So if you've ever attended a congregational prayer, there's a really high chance you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're standing in the prayer line, the saf, trying to get focused, and the person right next to you absolutely insists on physically touching their foot to yours. You might feel a bit awkward, so you slide your foot away just a tiny bit. But then, boom, they immediately slide their foot right back over to touch yours again. It turns into this weird, silent dance of feet right when you're supposed to be deep in spiritual contemplation. So why does this happen? Why is there such an intense focus on this literal physical contact? Well, according to the Sheikh's Q&A, this well-intentioned practice actually causes a bunch of negative outcomes. He points out that this constant foot-seeking behavior actively harms the worshiper. It creates a massive distraction from the salah, the prayer itself. You're suddenly shifting your focus from the divine to this physical annoyance happening down at floor level. Plus, it breeds frustration among the congregation. In some extreme cases, the source notes that this insistence on spreading out to touch feet can literally force someone at the very end of the row completely out of the line just because they don't have enough physical space to stand anymore. The Sheikh argues this behavior borders on fanaticism and completely clashes with the beautiful concept of al-wasatiyah, balance and moderation, which is a principle that's supposed to be woven into all of Islamic law. Section 1. The literal interpretation. Texts and implications. Okay, so this behavior isn't just random, right? It stems directly from a few specific hadiths, which are the recorded sayings and traditions. Worshippers who insist on touching feet are usually leaning pretty heavily on three famous commands. First, straighten your rows. Second, fill the gaps. And third, do not leave openings for seating. Now, when you read those completely in isolation or without the proper linguistic context, you can totally see how someone might think, oh, I need to seal every single millimeter of space between myself and the next guy, or else I'm leaving a literal physical gap. And this right here is Sheikh Abu Iyas' central argument. He says many people are actually transgressing against these very texts by reading them so superficially. They read the commands to straighten rows and then just derive their own strict physical rulings as if they were qualified scholars. And this is a huge distinction in jurisprudence, they're doing it without fully grasping the deeper linguistic context of the original language. He notes that a lot of the folks enforcing these physical boundaries can't even read the texts correctly in their original scholarly context. Section 2. Defining the gap. When is a row actually broken? So the real crux of the issue is figuring out what legally constitutes a gap that breaks the prayer row. And the Sheikh gives us a very clear, highly practical definition. A broken row happens when the gap between two worshippers is large enough to allow an entirely new worshipper to stand in it. Let that sink in for a second. It is not about a tiny sliver of daylight between your shoes. It is strictly about a space large enough for a whole person to step into. If another person cannot fit in the space between you and your neighbor, well, legally speaking, there is no gap. The row is perfectly intact. Now, check out this specific measurement the Sheikh provides, 5 or 10. We're not talking about microscopic distances here. He's talking about centimeters. The Sheikh explicitly clarifies that if the space between your feet and the person next to you isn't big enough for a person to stand, say you have 5 to 10 centimeters of space between your feet, then the row is legally continuous. It is absolutely not broken, and no sin is being committed. Think of it like floor tiles. Closely laid tiles can form a continuous, unified line without literally grinding against each other, right? A few centimeters of breathing room doesn't compromise the row at all. You don't need literal physical friction to maintain structural integrity. Section 3, the solid structure metaphor, battles and prayers. To really drive this home, he cites Surah As-Saf, Ayah 4, which says, "Surely Allah loves those who fight in his cause in solid ranks as if they were one concrete structure." It's a beautifully evocative verse, and it's specifically describing a battlefield formation. The key phrase here is bunyan marsus, which translates to a solid structure or concrete structure. The Sheikh uses this verse to draw a fantastic logical parallel. On a battlefield, soldiers are commanded to be in solid ranks, like a concrete structure. But does that mean every single soldier must have their feet literally glued to the feet of the guy next to them? Of course not. That would be completely impossible. It would totally hinder their ability to move, defend themselves, and actually fight. The structural unity being talked about is metaphorical. It's about forming an impenetrable line, not about binding your ankles together. The sheikh argues that the exact same logic applies to the prayer ranks. When the text says, straighten your rows, it means forming a unified, aligned front, but doing so without hindering the worshiper's ability to pray comfortably. So at the end of the day, this whole debate just boils down to this: metaphorical closeness and alignment versus literal physical bonding. The sheikh's resolution is crystal clear. These historical and religious texts are calling for unity. They want people to stand shoulder to shoulder in spirit, in general alignment, and just ensure no massive gaps are left wide open. They are absolutely not demanding a literal physical bonding of feet that distracts people, creates animosity, and disrupts the peace of the congregation. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to think about. When we look at this seemingly small dispute over foot placement, it actually opens up a much larger conversation about how we read and interpret texts. How often do rigid, literal interpretations of ancient texts create modern-day friction that completely misses the broader, much more important point of unity and balance? It's a fascinating question about linguistics, law, and human behavior. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I really hope this helps clarify the nuances behind the texts. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.